It usually does so gently at first, through muffled footsteps on wooden floors, to the hum of furnace fighting winter, to the quiet impatience of someone waking too early because joy makes sleep impossible. In this town, Christmas had always arrived the same way. Predictable, reliable, almost rehearsed. Lights still glowing from the night before. Wrapping paper waiting to be torn. Coffee already brewing in kitchens that smell faintly of pine and cinnamon. But on this Christmas morning, something didn't arrive. There were no footsteps. The sun came up anyway, pale and hesitant, like it wasn't entirely sure it was welcome. Snow had fallen overnight, not heavily, but just enough to soften the edges of the world. Roofs were capped in white. Cars were buried halfway in driveways. The road that ran through town looked untouched, as if no one had yet decided to begin the day. In most houses, that stillness felt peaceful. In two, it felt wrong. At first, no one noticed. Why would they? Christmas mornings are private things. Curtains stay drawn. Doors stay shut. Absence hides easily behind the expectation of rest. Someone sleeping in. Someone visiting family elsewhere. Someone deciding, just this once, to keep the morning quiet. It wasn't until late morning that the quiet began to feel heavier than it should have. A neighbor stepped outside to shake snow from a porch mat and noticed something small but unsettling. The front door next door was unlocked. Not wide open, just unlocked. The kind of detail that wouldn't matter on any other day, but on Christmas, when routines are sacred, it lingered in the mind longer than it should have. Inside that house, gifts sat untouched beneath a tree that still blinked cheerfully, unaware it had outlived its purpose. A kettle rested cold on the stove. Coats hung where they always hung. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, except the people. Another house, a few streets away, told the same story. Bed neatly made, shoes by the door, a calendar on the wall with December 25th circled, a small handwritten note beside it. Morning service. The ink looked almost hopeful. By noon, whispers began. By evening, the word disappear was spoken out loud for the first time, though no one liked how it sounded. Too final, too dramatic, too un-Christmas. Searches began the way they always do in small towns, informally, with neighbors checking familiar places first. The local store, a relative's house, the church, especially the church. Christmas morning meant tradition, and tradition meant that old building at the edge of town, where bells once rang loud enough to echo off the hills. But the church was dark. No lights, no bells, no footsteps in the snow leading to its doors. That detail unsettled people more than they admitted. The church had been closed for years, officially, but unofficially, it still existed in the town's emotional geography. People avoided it, but they noticed it. They didn't go inside, but they marked time by it, by how much more the roof sagged each winter, by how the paint peeled further every summer. On that morning, it stood exactly as it always had, silent, patient, waiting. Authorities were called eventually, though not urgently. There was no sign of struggle, no broken glass, no blood, no note, just absence. Clean, quiet, almost polite absence. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but earns it anyway. By nightfall, Christmas dinner went cold in several houses. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Children were sent to bed early, sensing something was wrong even if no one explained it. The town tried to celebrate around the gap where two people should have been, but the space they left behind refused to be ignored. That night, snow fell again. By morning, it had erased most of the footprints from the previous day. Any accidental clues, any evidence of hesitation or panic. Nature did what it always does. It smoothed things over, making the world look whole again. But the absence remained. Over the next few days, people would replay that morning in their minds, searching for a moment when something could have been different. A knock they didn't answer, a thought they dismissed, a door they didn't try. Years later, they would still remember the feeling more than the facts. The way joy drained from the day without warning. The way silence seemed to spread room to room, street to street, until it wrapped the entire town. Christmas morning came and went, and two lives slipped quietly out of the story. leaving behind a stillness so complete it took 35 years for anyone to realize it had never truly lifted. To understand what vanished on Christmas morning, you have to return the days before it, to a December that felt, on the surface, like every other one the town had known. Winter arrived early that year. Not dramatically, not with storms that shut everything down, but with a slow, creeping cold that settled into bones and routines. Mornings began later. Evenings stretched longer. People moved through their days with a quiet efficiency that comes from knowing exactly what was expected of them. The two who would disappear were part of that rhythm. Not central figures, not people who commanded attention when they entered a room. They were familiar in the way furniture is familiar. You notice immediately when it's gone, but rarely think about it while it's there. In the weeks before Christmas, they were seen doing ordinary things, buying groceries, exchanging small talk that never went very deep, standing in line at the post office with cards addressed in careful handwriting. No one remembers them arguing. No one remembers them celebrating. What people remember is neutrality, a kind of emotional flatness that didn't raise alarms at the time. One of them was known for routine. Same path through town every morning. Same stop at the same store. Same polite nod to the same clerk. There was comfort in that predictability, both for them and for the people who watched it unconsciously from the edges of their own lives. Routine made a person feel anchored. Even when no one knew what they were anchored to, the other carried a quieter presence. Less visible, more internal. Someone who listened more than they spoke, who attended gatherings without ever staying too long. People would later say they seemed distracted that December, though no one could explain exactly why. It's a detail that only becomes meaningful after the fact. As Christmas approached, decorations went up slowly. The town never rushed these things. Wreaths appeared on doors. Lights were strung unevenly along fences. A tree was raised in the square, decorated with ornaments that had been used so many times the paint had begun to wear thin. The church, meanwhile, remained closed. It had been that way for years, technically. Official reasons were vague. Maintenance issues, dwindling attendance, funding. But unofficially, people avoided talking about it. The building still stood, just beyond the edge of daily life, its doors locked, its windows clouded with dust and age. Yet it lingered in conversation more than anyone realized, especially in December. Some remembered Christmas services from years ago, the smell of wax and old wood, the way voices filled the space and echoed back slightly altered. Others remembered sermons that felt heavier than they should have, words about obedience and sacrifice that sat uncomfortably alongside carols in candlelight. In the days before Christmas that year, a few people noticed something strange. One of the missing had been seen near the church. Not inside, just near it, standing at the edge of the property longer than necessary, as if deciding something. At the time, it meant nothing. People walk. People think. People pause. The town was good at not asking questions that didn't insist on being answered. Inside their homes, preparations were modest. Gifts were wrapped carefully but not extravagantly. Meals were planned with practicality rather than indulgence. Christmas, for them, wasn't about spectacle. It was about continuity, doing what had always been done. There were signs in hindsight that something was off. A canceled appointment. A conversation cut short. A look that lingered a second too long on the past instead of the future. But these signs were scattered, disconnected. Alone, they meant nothing. Even together, they didn't form a picture yet. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that December wasn't just moving toward Christmas. It was closing on a decision that had been forming quietly for a long time. A decision shaped by belief, pressure, fear, and a deep exhaustion that comes from feeling trapped inside a life that doesn't quite belong to you anymore. The town itself played a role in that feeling. It was a kind of place where people noticed changes, but rarely addressed them, where privacy was respected to the point of neglect, where staying silent was often mistaken for kindness. In such a place, it was possible to unravel without anyone seeing the thread come loose. On Christmas Eve, the town slowed even further. Shops closed early. Streets emptied. Snow began to fall again, light and steady, softening sounds and blurring edges. Inside houses, televisions murmured. Plates were washed and set aside. People prepared for a morning they assumed would arrive like it always had. Somewhere in that quiet, the last ordinary moments unfolded. A light was turned off. A door was closed. Shoes were set neatly by an entryway. Not in haste. Not in panic. With care. That detail matters. Because whatever happened next was not sudden. It was not explosive or chaotic. It was deliberate, slow, and wrapped in the language of purpose. The kind of choice that doesn't feel like a choice at all when you believe it's the only path left. When the town went to sleep that night, it did so under the illusion of familiarity. Nothing had broken yet. Nothing had announced itself as wrong. And when Christmas morning came, it didn't shatter that illusion immediately. It simply revealed that somewhere in the darkness, the last ordinary December had quietly ended, and something irreversible had taken its place. Long before anyone noticed they were gone, before absence became a word spoken in lowered voices, December had already begun pressing in on them. It was the kind of month that encourages reflection without asking permission. Shorter days, longer shadows, a cold that seeps in slowly enough that you don't realize how deep it has gone until movement itself feels heavier. In this town, December always carried particular weight. Not dread exactly, but expectation. The same decorations, the same conversations, the same rituals repeated. So often they felt older than memory itself. The two who would disappear moved through the season quietly. They were not new to the town. They were not outsiders. They belonged in the subtle, unremarkable way that made them easy to overlook. Their lives were not dramatic, not visibly unstable. From the outside, nothing about them suggested an ending was approaching. One of them lived by habit more than desire. Wake at the same time. Walk the same streets. Exchange the same small talk that never revealed anything real. People trusted that kind of consistency. It made them feel safe, reassured them that nothing unexpected was happening beneath the surface. The other existed more on the margins, not isolated, but inward. Someone who listened carefully, who carried thoughts longer than necessary before letting them go. In early December, a few people later recalled noticing a change, an absence of something rather than the presence of anything new. Less engagement, less eye contact, a kind of quiet retreat that didn't alarm anyone at the time. In this town, retreat was normal. Everyone was taught early on that personal matters stayed personal. You didn't pry. You didn't push. You assumed people would speak when they were ready. That belief had shaped generations, and it would quietly shape what happened next. As Christmas drew closer, routines intensified instead of relaxing. Decorations appeared, but without joy, more out of obligation than excitement. The same plastic nativity sets. The same strings of lights pulled from boxes that smelled faintly of dust and storage. People smiled because they were expected to, not because they felt particularly celebratory. The church remained closed, as it had been for years. Officially, it was no longer part of town life. Unofficially, it still hovered in the background, unresolved. Its absence from use did not erase its influence. In December especially, it resurfaced in conversation, not directly, but through memory, through comparison, through phrases like back when and before it closed. Some remembered the church fondly, candlelit services, choir voices trembling slightly in the cold air. Others remembered something harder to name, sermons that felt more like warnings and comfort, an emphasis on obedience that sat uneasily alongside celebration. No one agreed on what the church had been, but everyone agreed it was better left alone. In the weeks before Christmas, one of the missing was seen near it more than once, not entering, just standing nearby, as if measuring distance, as if deciding whether to cross a line that had been drawn years ago and never erased. It was mentioned casually at the time, almost jokingly. Probably just walking, someone said, and that was enough. Inside their homes, preparations were restrained. Gifts were modest, wrapped carefully but without enthusiasm. Food was planned simply. Christmas, for them, wasn't about abundance. It was about structure, about marking time. There were small disruptions, though no one recognized them, as such until much later. A meeting canceled without explanation. A missed phone call that wasn't returned. A conversation cut short when it seemed like it might drift somewhere uncomfortable. These moments were easy to dismiss. December was busy. People were tired. Everyone assumed normal explanations. What they didn't see was the accumulation. Pressure doesn't arrive all at once. It layers itself slowly. Beliefs repeated until they sound like facts. Expectations reinforced until they feel unavoidable. In this town, tradition carried authority. And authority, once internalized, rarely needed enforcement. For one of them, faith had once been grounding. For the other, it had always been complicated. Over time, those differences blurred into something more dangerous. A shared sense that deviation was failure, that dissatisfaction was weakness, that wanting something else meant something was wrong with you. No one taught them that directly. They absorbed it. The town did not offer many alternatives. There were paths you followed, and paths you didn't. Most people never questioned that. Those who did learned quickly to keep it quiet. By mid-December, snow had begun to fall more regularly. Streets emptied earlier in the evenings. Darkness settled before dinner. Inside, the television filled space where conversation might have gone. Silence became easier than articulation. On Christmas Eve, the town slowed to a near standstill. Shops closed early. Streets emptied. Lights glowed behind curtains. Snow fell softly, steadily, erasing sharp edges and making everything feel muted. That night, nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices. No visible conflict. No frantic decisions made in haste. Instead, there were final ordinary actions. A light switched off deliberately. A door locked carefully. Shoes placed side by side, aligned rather than kicked aside. These were not the movements of panic. They were the movements of intention. That distinction matters. Because whatever followed was not an accident. It was not a momentary lapse. It was a culmination of weeks, months, perhaps years of internal negotiation, of being told, explicitly or implicitly, that endurance was virtue, that obedience was safety, that leaving was worse than staying. The town slept that night, believing everything was as it should be. And in the quiet hours before dawn, the last ordinary December slipped away, not with violence or spectacle, but with a silence so complete it went unnoticed until it was far too late. The church had never left the town, even after everyone stopped going. It stood just far enough away from the center that it could be ignored without being forgotten. A short drive, a longer walk, close enough to see from certain roads if you happen to glance in the right direction, distant enough that no one ever went there by accident. It was positioned the way uncomfortable truths often are, on the edge of daily life, present but avoidable. From the outside, it looked like time had simply paused around it. The paint had peeled unevenly, revealing older layers beneath, as if each decade had left its mark and then moved on. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, not enough to seem urgent, but enough to suggest neglect had become permanent. Windows were clouded with grime and age, reflecting the sky more than the interior, making it impossible to see inside unless the light hit just right. Most people couldn't remember the last time they had been through its doors. Some said it closed because attendance dropped. Others claimed the cost of repairs became too high. A few whispered about internal disagreements, though no one ever explained what those disagreements were. The official story shifted depending on who told it, which made it easier for everyone to accept none of it mattered anymore. Yet the building remained. Children dared each other to walk up to it, but never touched the door. Teenagers drove past it late at night, slowing down just enough to feel brave without stopping. Adults avoided it altogether, choosing routes that didn't require looking at it for too long. The church was not feared. It was avoided. And there is a difference. In December, its presence felt heavier. As if the cold drew attention, things left unfinished. The silence around the building was deeper than elsewhere, not because sound couldn't reach it, but because no one brought sound there anymore. No laughter. No voices raised in song. No bells. Those bells still hung in the tower, though. Rusted. Motionless. Waiting. Years earlier, they had marked time for the town. Weddings. Funerals. Holidays. Their absence now marked something else, a withdrawal, a pause that never quite resolved. People remembered different versions of the church, depending on when they had known it. For some, it had been warm and welcoming, a place where community gathered and certainty was offered freely. For others, it had felt heavy, prescriptive, less about comfort and more about correction. Those memories coexisted without ever being reconciled. What united them was this: no one spoke about how it ended. The closure hadn't been abrupt. There was no final service that everyone remembered clearly. No dramatic announcement. Instead, attendance dwindled. Activities were canceled quietly. Repairs were postponed. Eventually, the doors were locked and no one questioned why. That kind of ending suited the town. Silence was familiar. Silence was safe. After the disappearances, the church took on a new shape in the town's imagination. It was mentioned more often, but always indirectly. Near there, someone would say, instead of naming it, that place, rather than the word church, as if saying it too clearly might invite something back. Investigators visited it briefly in the early days. They walked the perimeter, noted the locked doors, recorded that there were no signs of recent entry. Then they moved on. The building did not insist on attention, and so it didn't receive much. Inside, dust settled undisturbed. Pews sat in neat rows. They were darkened with age and neglect. Hymnals remained tucked into racks, their pages yellowed, their titles faded. Light filtered through stained glass and muted colors, painting the floor with patterns that no longer meant anything to anyone. Time moved differently there. It always had. Somewhere inside the building, records remained. Old meeting notes, sermon drafts, marginalia written by hands that believed deeply in what they were saying. Words about duty, about sacrifice, about the dangers of deviation disguised as care. But no one read them then. Outside, life continued. The town adapted. The disappearances slowly receded from urgency into memory. People learned how to speak about them in the past tense without feeling cruel. Christmases passed. Snow fell. Children grew up. And the church waited. It absorbed the seasons without protest. Rain soaked into the wood. Wind rattled loose panes. Animals found shelter in corners where people once knelt. It did not decay dramatically. It simply endured. That endurance mattered more than anyone realized, because buildings, like people, hold what they are given. And for years, this one had been holding silence. Unasked questions, unexamined authority, beliefs that had never been dismantled, only abandoned. When people thought about the disappearances, they rarely connected them directly to the church. The idea felt too heavy, too complicated. Easier to believe the two had left on their own. Easier to imagine an explanation that didn't implicate anyone else. But memory has a way of circling back. Decades later, when someone finally stood before the church doors again, key in hand, it wasn't fear that stopped them for a moment. It was recognition. A sense that this place had not been empty all those years. That it had been waiting, not to accuse, not to threaten, but to be acknowledged. To finally release what it had been quietly holding since the winter, when two lives slipped out of sight, and everyone agreed not to look too closely at where they might have gone. Time did what it always does after something unresolved. It moved forward without actually carrying anything away. In the years following the disappearances, the town changed in ways that were easy to measure and harder to feel. New paint on old houses. A few businesses closed, others opened under different names. Roads were repaved. Streetlights were replaced. From a distance, it looked like progress. From inside, it felt more like accommodation. People learned how to live around the absence. At first, the missing were spoken about often. Their names surfaced in conversations that circled the same unanswered questions. Where could they have gone? Why that morning? Why without telling anyone? Speculation filled the early months, then slowly thinned as repetition drained of urgency. Each theory sounded less convincing the second time it was spoken. Eventually, people stopped asking new questions and began recycling old ones. Search efforts faded quietly. There were no announcements declaring them over, no formal conclusion. They simply lost momentum, like a conversation that trails off when no one knows what to say next. Official files were closed without ceremony. Boxes labeled with their names were placed on shelves and left there. What remained was memory. Every Christmas, that memory returned whether people invited it or not. Decorations went up, but more slowly. Some households stopped putting up trees altogether. Others did so out of stubbornness, determined not to let the past claim something it didn't deserve. Children noticed a shift without understanding it. They sensed tension where joy was supposed to be. Stories changed as they were passed down. At first, children were told that two people had gone away. Later, they were told they had been lost. Eventually, the story became a cautionary absence, a reminder that not everything has an explanation and not every ending is clean. What was never explained was why the town never held a memorial. No plaque, no bench, no ceremony. It wasn't cruelty. It was discomfort. Memorials fixed things in place, and nothing about the disappearances felt fixed. To acknowledge them publicly would have meant admitting the story wasn't finished, that it still belonged to the town in some way. So the missing lived on in smaller ways, in empty seats at holiday tables, in names that were never reused, in houses that changed owners but never quite lost their quiet. People said those places felt colder, though no one could say why. New residents arrived over the years, unaware of what had happened. They noticed the town's reserve, its careful politeness, its reluctance to discuss certain topics. If they asked about the church, they received vague answers. If they asked about the past, conversations gently shifted elsewhere. Silence became tradition. The children who grew up hearing fragments of the story carried it with them into adulthood. Some left and never looked back. Others stayed, inheriting not just property and routines, but unease. They learned which questions were acceptable and which ones weren't worth asking. Christmas remained the most difficult. It was impossible to separate the season from the absence that had marked it. Snowfall brought back the memory of untouched ground. Morning light recalled doors that never opened. Even joy felt restrained, as if too much of it might be disrespectful. Over time, the missing stopped aging in people's minds. They remained frozen at the moment they vanished, while everyone else moved on. This made remembering them feel strange, almost unreal, like thinking about characters from a story rather than people who had once lived next door. The church continued to stand, aging alongside the town. Its decay became familiar. People measured years by how much worse it looked. The church was never repaired, but it was never demolished either. It existed in a kind of suspended state, mirroring the story it held. Occasionally, someone would suggest doing something with it, turning it into storage, tearing it down, selling the land. The ideas never went anywhere. Paperwork stalled. Interest faded. No one pushed. Inertia proved powerful. As decades passed, the disappearances lost their edge but not their weight. They became part of the town's identity in subtle ways. A shared history that didn't require details. A quiet understanding that some things were better left undisturbed. Yet unresolved things don't disappear. They wait. By the 35th year, most of the original adults were gone or elderly. The ones who remember the morning clearly carried it differently now. Not as shock, but as something closer to guilt. They wondered, sometimes, if they had missed something obvious, if they had chosen comfort over curiosity. When talk of the church resurfaced, this time seriously, it stirred more than practical concerns. It disturbed something long settled but never resolved. The idea of entering that space again felt intrusive, almost wrong. But it also felt inevitable. Time had preserved the silence long enough. The echoes had grown too loud to ignore. And as the town stood on the edge of revisiting what it had avoided for decades, one thing became clear. The disappearances had never really ended. They had only been waiting for someone to finally listen to what the years of quiet had been trying to say. An inspection request, a liability concern, the kind of bureaucratic language that strips emotion from places that have accumulated far too much of it. The church, long ignored, had finally crossed a line from forgotten to inconvenient. The roof was no longer just sagging. It was unsafe. The land it sat on had value now. Time, which had once protected the building through neglect, had turned against it. When word spread that someone would be going inside, the reaction was quieter than expected. No protests, no curiosity-driven crowds, just a subtle tightening in the way people spoke about it, a collective hesitation, as if everyone understood that opening that door meant reopening something else. The person tasked with entering the church was not a stranger. They grew up nearby. They knew the building only as an outline against the sky, as something you passed but never approached. Even so, standing in front of it felt different than expected. Heavier, not threatening, just dense with something unnamed. The door was still locked. That, at least, felt familiar. The key turned with resistance, metal scraping against metal in a way that echoed louder than it should have. The sound carried inside the empty structure, bouncing back altered, distorted by space and time. For a moment, no one moved. Then the door opened. The air inside was cold, but not stale. It didn't smell like rot or abandonment. It smelled preserved. Dust, yes, but also wood, paper, and something faintly metallic. The kind of smell that suggests things have been left exactly as they were. Light entered cautiously, cutting through the dim in narrow bands. It revealed rows of pews still aligned, an altar still standing, a lectern slightly off-center, as if someone had adjusted it and never come back to finish the thought. The floor creaked under careful steps. Every movement felt intrusive, like interrupting a long-held silence. There was no sense of danger, but there was a clear sense of presence, not of people, but of intention. The building felt paused rather than empty. Initial documentation focused on structure, cracks in the ceiling, water damage near the back, broken glass in a side window. All of it ordinary for a building left alone this long. Then someone noticed the door. At the rear of the sanctuary, partially concealed behind stacked hymnals and a collapsed shelf, was a door not marked on any current plans. It wasn't hidden deliberately. It was simply forgotten, its existence erased by time and assumption. It wasn't locked. That detail shifted the tone immediately. Inside was a narrow room, barely lit even when daylight reached it. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes labeled in careful handwriting. Dates, names, categories that meant nothing at first glance. There was no dust on the topmost box. That mattered. It meant someone had been there after the church was supposed to have been closed. Further inside, there were signs of use that didn't belong to the past. A chair pulled away from a desk. A notebook with more recent pages. Candle stubs not yet melted into history. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming on its own. But together, they suggested continuity. This space hadn't been abandoned the way the rest of the building had. It had been maintained. Quietly, intentionally. As records were examined, inconsistencies began to surface. Meeting notes dated months after the official closure. Maintenance logs signed by hands that didn't appear in any formal documentation. Sermon draft that referenced continued guidance and necessary withdrawal. Language that implied secrecy framed as care. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became that the church had not simply shut down. It had narrowed, pulled inward, reduced its visible footprint while preserving its internal authority. And that raised a more uncomfortable question. If the church had still been active in some form, who had been involved? The names in the boxes were familiar. Some belonged to people long gone. Others belonged to individuals who still lived in town. Their association with the church assumed to have ended decades earlier. No one had spoken about this version of the church. No one had admitted it existed. As the day wore on, the atmosphere inside the building changed. Not in a supernatural sense, but in a psychological one. The more evidence emerged, the more the space felt less like a ruin and more like a witness. Something else was found near the back. Personal items stored carefully rather than discarded. Clothing folded, not left behind in haste. Shoes placed side by side. A blanket arranged with intention. These were not signs of transience. They were signs of staying. The realization arrived slowly, settling into the room with the weight of inevitability. Whatever had happened to the missing had not occurred in a moment. It had unfolded over time. In this building, behind these walls, the door that had never been locked had not been an oversight. It had been an invitation. And for 35 years, no one had accepted it. Until now, once the door had been opened, there was no way to pretend the building was empty anymore. The church did not reveal its story all at once. It offered it in fragments, the way memory does when it has been left alone for too long. Nothing announced itself as a truth. Instead, understanding emerged slowly, built from small contradictions and overlooked details that no longer fit together the way they were supposed to. The records came first. Boxes filled with documents that spanned years beyond the church's official closure. Attendance notes written in the same careful hand. Lists of names that appeared, disappeared, and reappeared without explanation. Marginal notes referencing meetings held off schedule and outside normal hours. There was nothing overtly alarming in the language, which made it more unsettling. Everything was framed as guidance, care, and protection. Dates were compared. And that was when the first fracture appeared. One meeting was recorded just days after Christmas, the same Christmas when 2 people had vanished. Another followed weeks later. Then another. The town had been grieving, speculating, moving on, while something continued quietly here, undisturbed. The building had not been abandoned. It had been selectively emptied. Physical evidence reinforced what the paperwork suggested. Footprints preserved beneath old mats. Candle wax dripped in layers, some clearly newer than others. Trash that had been disposed of neatly rather than carelessly. Evidence of order, not chaos. In one corner of the side room, a calendar hung on the wall. Most of its pages were yellowed, but the final months were different, less faded, marked with careful notations. Certain days were circled. Others were crossed out entirely. Christmas was circled, not celebrated, not annotated, just circled. The realization unsettled everyone who saw it. There was no sign of violence, no struggle, no indication that anyone had been held against their will in a way that left physical marks. That absence forced a harder conclusion. What happened here was psychological. Control does not always require force. Sometimes it requires repetition, authority, the slow erosion of alternatives until compliance feels like relief. The documents were full of that language. Phrases about protection from outside influence, about the danger of doubt, about the virtue of withdrawal. Withdrawal from what? From the town, from family, from life as it had been. Personal writings began to emerge next. Journals tucked between official records, their tone markedly different. Where the institutional documents were calm and assured, these were hesitant, searching. Questions scribbled in margins, doubts crossed out and rewritten. Expressions of fear disguised as devotion. One entry stood out. It described Christmas not as a celebration, but as a threshold, a moment of purification, a necessary separation between what was and what needed to be left behind. The language was intimate, almost tender, but underneath it was exhaustion, a longing for certainty at any cost. The implication was impossible to ignore. The disappearance was not spontaneous. It had been prepared. As the picture sharpened, the timeline became clearer. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, meetings increased. Guidance intensified. Language shifted subtly from suggestion to expectation, from encouragement to inevitability. And then, on Christmas morning, 2 people were no longer where they were supposed to be, not because they had run, but because they had been redirected. The church walls bore witness to that redirection. Marks on the floor where furniture had been moved repeatedly, a corner where blankets had been folded and refolded, a small space behind the altar where someone had clearly spent time alone, not hidden, set apart. That distinction mattered to whoever had orchestrated this. There were no names attached to the authority behind it all, no single signature that could be blamed. Power here had been diffuse, shared, reinforced by silence and agreement. Everyone involved believed they were doing something necessary, something good. That belief made accountability slippery. As more people were brought in to review the findings, reactions varied. Some denied the implications outright. Others went quiet, recognizing phrases they had once heard spoken aloud. A few admitted they had known something was continuing inside the church, but had chosen not to ask questions, not out of malice. Out of fear, the walls had not remembered violence. They had remembered obedience. and that made the truth harder to face. Because if the disappearance had been a result of coercion disguised as care, then responsibility did not rest with one person or one moment. It rested with a system, a culture, a town that had learned to look away when certainty was offered too confidently. By the time the review ended, one thing was undeniable. The church had not merely been the backdrop to what happened. It had been the mechanism. And for 35 years, it had held that truth quietly, waiting for someone to finally listen to what its walls had been saying all along. The hardest truth did not come from the records or the room or the objects left behind. It came from understanding why no one had screamed. There was no evidence of restraint, no signs of forced confinement, no indication that anyone had tried to escape in a way that left marks on walls or doors. The space that had once held them was not a cell. It was arranged almost gently, cleaned, ordered, made to feel purposeful. That realization reframed everything. Whatever happened here was not built on sudden violence. It was built on consent shaped by pressure, on choices narrowed so tightly they no longer felt like choices at all. The kind of control that convinces you you're being protected, even as your world quietly disappears. The writings told that story more clearly than anything else. One journal, thinner than the others, appeared to have been written in short bursts, as if time itself was rationed. Early entries were hopeful, almost relieved. Words like clarity, direction, relief appeared often. The writer described feeling seen in a way they hadn't before, guided in a way that felt reassuring rather than restrictive. Later entries changed tone. Sentences grew shorter. Questions crept in, then were crossed out. Doubt was acknowledged only to be corrected, often in the same paragraph. The language mirrored the sermons found nearby. Phrases repeated until they sounded rehearsed, not felt. It was clear someone else's voice had begun to replace their own. Another set of notes, written by the second missing person, was even more restrained, less expressive, more obedient. Where the first journal wrestled with uncertainty, this one documented acceptance, not peace, but resignation presented as faith. The contrast between the two was painful. One was still trying to understand what was happening to them. The other had already surrendered the need to understand it all. Together, they formed a complete picture. This was not an abduction. It was a narrowing. The church's leadership, if it could even be called that, had not needed to issue threats. Authority had already been internalized. Years of sermons emphasizing sacrifice over self, obedience over intuition, had done the work quietly. By the time withdrawal was suggested, it felt like responsibility. By the time isolation was encouraged, it felt like devotion. And by the time leaving became unthinkable, staying felt like the only moral option. Christmas morning was chosen deliberately, not for cruelty, but for symbolism, a day associated with rebirth, purification, separation from the old. The notes framed it as a crossing point, a moment when distraction would be at its lowest and commitment would feel highest. Family gatherings, celebration, noise, all of it was described as interference. The idea was not to disappear violently, but cleanly, without confrontation, without explanation that might invite doubt from others. One entry captured it plainly. Leaving quietly is proof of faith. That sentence sat alone on the page. No justification, no follow-up, just certainty. As days turned into weeks inside the church, the psychological toll became evident. The notes referenced fatigue, confusion, a sense of time slipping, not because they were imprisoned, but because routine had been stripped down to obedience and reflection. Without external markers, days blended together. Isolation did the rest. Humans measure reality through other people. Remove that, and belief becomes the only anchor left. The church understood this well. It had always taught that the outside world was unreliable, corrupting, dangerous. Inside these walls, those lessons became lived experience. There was no dramatic breaking point recorded, no moment when resistance peaked. Instead, the writing simply stopped, not abruptly, gradually, shorter entries, fewer details, until finally, nothing. The absence of a final note was its own kind of ending. It suggested not escape, not death, but erasure, A self slowly folded into doctrine until there was nothing left to record. That understanding hit the town harder than any imagined crime ever could have, because it meant the disappearance wasn't something done to them. It was something done with them, through belief, trust, and a desire to be good, and that made the guilt unbearable. People began to recognize fragments of those teachings in their own past, phrases they had nodded along to, ideas they had accepted without question. The realization spread quietly. The system that had led 2 people into disappearance had shaped far more lives than just theirs. The church had not needed locks. It had needed agreement. When officials debated what to call what happened, language failed them. Cult felt too dramatic. Crime felt too narrow. Tragedy felt too passive. The truth lived somewhere in between. What happened was a removal of agency disguised as purpose. And the most devastating part was this. At some point, the 2 had likely believed they were doing the right thing, that they were choosing something higher, something meaningful. By the time doubt might have fully surfaced, they were already too far removed to act on it. The town struggled with how to honor that truth without justifying it. Memorials felt insufficient. Explanations felt hollow. Apologies, offered decades too late, echoed into nothing. What remained was an understanding that disappearance doesn't always look like panic or violence. Sometimes it looks like obedience, like stillness, like people quietly stepping out of their own lives because they were taught that disappearing was a form of devotion. And once that truth settled in, the church was no longer just an abandoned building. It was a mirror, one that reflected not only what happened to 2 people on Christmas morning, but what can happen anywhere certainty goes unquestioned, and silence is mistaken for peace. Once the truth began to surface, silence stopped feeling neutral. For decades, it had been described as restraint, as respect, as the town's way of allowing grief to exist without spectacle. Now it revealed itself as something else entirely, an active force that had shaped outcomes, not merely observed them. Questions spread quietly at first. Who had attended those meetings after the church was supposed to be closed? Who had known the doors were still being opened, the candles still being lit, the authority still being exercised? Who had sensed something was wrong and chosen not to look too closely? No one stood up and confessed to orchestrating anything. There was no single figure to point to, no villain shaped cleanly enough to absorb all the blame. That absence complicated everything. Responsibility, it turned out, was distributed. Some remembered being invited to gatherings that felt different, but not explicitly dangerous. They declined and thought no more of it. Others attended briefly, felt uncomfortable, and left, grateful they had the option to do so, unaware that not everyone felt the same freedom. A few admitted they had heard rumors even then, that people were being encouraged to withdraw, to cut ties, to commit more deeply. But rumors were easy to dismiss, especially when they challenged beliefs that had once felt stabilizing. The town had trusted the language of care too easily. When the disappearances occurred, that trust turned into rationalization. It was easier to believe the missing had left voluntarily than to confront the possibility that something within the community had failed them. Easier to imagine a clean break than a shared responsibility. Silence had made that easier. As details emerged, people began to revisit old conversations in their minds. Moments when someone had seemed distressed but composed. Statements that now sounded like rehearsed justification rather than personal conviction. Invitations framed as concern that, in hindsight, felt like pressure. The weight of those memories settled unevenly. For some, it brought guilt. For others, anger. A few reacted with defensiveness, insisting that no one could have known, that hindsight was distorting reality. All of those reactions coexisted, creating tension that had not existed in years. Public meetings were held, not to assign blame officially, but to acknowledge what had been uncovered. The tone was careful, restrained. No one wanted to fracture the town further. But even restraint carried consequences now. People spoke about moral responsibility rather than legal culpability, about how systems persist because individuals support them, often without intent, about how silence, when repeated enough, becomes endorsement. Some names were mentioned, not accused outright, but references having held influence during the years the church quietly continued. Those individuals responded with a mixture of denial and justification. They insisted their intentions had been good, that they had only ever wanted a guide, not control. Intent, however, no longer felt sufficient as a defense. What had happened did not require malice to be devastating. It required certainty. It required belief that authority should not be questioned, and a community willing to defer to it rather than interrogate it. The town began to understand that harm can occur even when everyone believes they are acting responsibly. That realization reshaped how the disappearances were discussed. No longer as an isolated tragedy, but as a product of a culture that valued cohesion over accountability, that valued peace over confrontation. For the families of the missing, this shift brought mixed relief. Validation, at last, that something had gone wrong, but also the knowledge that the truth did not restore what had been lost. There was no recovery to follow revelation, no justice in the traditional sense, only understanding. And understanding, when it arrives too late, carries its own kind of pain. Christmas returned again that year, as it always did, but it felt different now. Not just subdued, but conscious. Decorations went up alongside conversations that would never have happened before. Children asked questions and received real answers, however incomplete. The town did not fracture under the weight of what it learned, but it did change shape. People became less comfortable with certainty that arrived fully formed, more willing to ask where guidance was coming from and who it served. The church, now clearly implicated, was no longer discussed with nostalgia or avoidance. It was discussed plainly. That, more than anything else, marked the end of its influence. Yet even as accountability began to take shape, one truth remained difficult to face. Silence had not been passive. It had been an action. Every moment when someone chose not to ask. Every time discomfort was mistaken for respect. Every decision to preserve harmony at the cost of curiosity had contributed to conditions that allowed two people to disappear without resistance. No one intended that outcome, but intention had never been the point. What mattered was what had been allowed to continue unchecked, and how long it had taken for anyone to question it. The town could not undo the past, but it could no longer pretend to have been uninvolved. When the meetings ended and the documents were archived, there was no sense of triumph, only a sober acknowledgement that truth, once surfaced, demands more than recognition. It demands change. And for the first time in 35 years, the town began to understand that remembering is not the same as reckoning, and that silence, once broken, does not easily settle back into place. The Christmas that followed the revelations did not announce itself with bells or ceremony. It arrived quietly, like a guest who knows they are no longer entirely welcome, but comes anyway because tradition insists. Snow fell again that year, as it always did, soft at first, then steadier, until the town looked briefly untouched, clean in a way that felt almost cruel. Decorations appeared in windows, though fewer than before. Lights were dimmer, simpler. No one seemed interested in excess. Joy, when it appeared, did so cautiously, as if it needed permission. For the first time in decades, the town spoke openly about the Christmas that never came back, not as rumor, not as speculation, but as fact. 2 lives had ended, not necessarily in death, but in erasure, on a morning meant to mark beginnings. That contradiction sat at the center of every conversation, every quiet pause during holiday gatherings. People struggled to reconcile the image of celebration with the reality of what had been taken. There was talk of a memorial. The idea surfaced tentatively, tested in conversation, before being said out loud in meetings. Some suggested a plaque, others a bench. Someone proposed a candlelight gathering on Christmas Eve. Each suggestion carried good intentions, and each felt inadequate in its own way. How do you memorialize absence? A marker implies completion, an ending, but nothing about what happened felt finished. The truth had been uncovered, yes, but the cost of it remained unresolved. A plaque could name them, but it could not return their voices. A ceremony could acknowledge the wrong, but it could not undo the years of silence that followed. In the end, the town chose something quieter. No permanent structure, no grand unveiling. On Christmas morning, just after sunrise, people gathered near the town square. No speeches were prepared. No prayers were scripted. They stood together in the cold, holding candles that flickered unsteadily in the wind. For a few minutes, no one spoke. That silence felt different from the one that had dominated the past. This silence was chosen. Names were read aloud, not as victims, not as symbols, but as people, simply spoken, without explanation or embellishment. Some attendees closed their eyes. Others stared at the ground. A few wept openly, no longer concerned with restraint. When it ended, people dispersed slowly. No one lingered for conversation. The moment did not ask to be analyzed or debated. It asked only to be acknowledged. Christmas dinner that day was subdued across the town. Families gathered, but traditions were adjusted. Stories were told more honestly. Children asked questions that adults no longer avoided. The myth of safety through silence had finally lost its hold. For the families most directly affected, the day was unbearable in ways no revelation could fix. Understanding does not heal everything. Knowing what happened did not restore time. It did not replace years lost of uncertainty, nor did it soften the grief of imagining lives slowly narrowed until they disappeared altogether. But there was something different now, something steadier. They were no longer alone with unanswered questions. The town, imperfect and late, had finally stepped into the truth alongside them. As winter deepened, attention turned back to the church. By now, its fate was inevitable. Structural reports confirmed what everyone already knew. The building was beyond repair. Years of neglect, exposure, and quiet decay had made restoration impractical. The question was no longer whether it would come down, but how. Demolition felt too abrupt to some. Erasure disguised as resolution. Others argued that leaving it standing meant allowing its shadow to persist, a constant reminder without context. A structure stripped of authority, but still capable of shaping memory in unintended ways. After weeks of discussion, a compromise emerged. The church would be documented thoroughly. Every room photographed, every record archived. Its history preserved not as nostalgia, but as evidence. Then it would be sealed, not demolished immediately, but closed definitively, its doors locked one final time, not to hide what happened, but to mark its end. On the day the final inspection took place, only a handful of people were present. No crowd, no ceremony, just those tasked with closing a chapter that had remained open for far too long. Inside, the air felt heavier than it had before, not with threat, but with finality. The rooms were emptier now, records removed, personal items cataloged. The space had lost its sense of intention. Its authority dissolved once exposed to daylight and scrutiny. It was just a building again. But buildings remember. As the last door was closed, there was no sense of triumph, only a quiet understanding that truth does not arrive to comfort. It arrives to clarify, and clarity often hurts more than ignorance ever did. Life inevitably continued. Spring came. Snow melted. The town returned to its rhythms, altered but intact. People laughed again without guilt. Celebrations regained warmth, though never the same innocence. Something had shifted permanently, and everyone felt it. The disappearances were no longer whispered. They were taught, not as legend or cautionary tale, but as history, as an example of how harm can grow quietly, how authority can persist without oversight, how good intentions can still lead to devastating outcomes. Children learn that questions are not acts of defiance, that silence is not always kindness, that certainty should be examined, not inherited. Those lessons became the real memorial. Years later, visitors would sometimes ask about the empty lot where the church once stood. The town answered honestly, without embellishment, without avoidance. And each time the story was told, it changed slightly, not in facts but in tone. Less fear, less shame, more resolve. Christmas still arrived each year, bringing with it memory and reflection. But it no longer belonged to the disappearance alone. It had reclaimed space for complexity, for grief and joy to exist together, without canceling each other out. The town never pretended to be healed. Some wounds do not close cleanly. They become part of the body's structure, influencing how it moves forward. But they no longer dictate direction. What remained was a shared understanding that disappearance is not always sudden, not always violent, not always visible. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, supported by systems and beliefs that go unexamined for too long. And that understanding, hard-earned and long overdue, became the town's responsibility to carry forward, not as punishment, but as proof that silence, once broken, can make room for something better, something honest, imperfect, and awake. The Christmas that never came back would always be remembered, but it would no longer be the only one that mattered. Long after the church doors were closed for the final time, long after the candles from that first public remembrance had burned down to nothing but wax-stained memories, the question that lingered was not what happened. It was what still remains. The empty lot where the church once stood did not feel empty at first. Grass took time to grow there. The ground seemed reluctant to smooth itself out, as if the soil itself remembered weight, structure, expectation. People avoided crossing it instinctively, choosing paths that curve around the space even after there was nothing left to see. Places like people do not forget easily. At night, the town grew quiet in a way it hadn't before, not tense, not watchful, but reflective. Silence had changed its meaning. It no longer served as concealment. It became a pause, a space where thoughts were allowed to surface without immediately being corrected or contained. People noticed that difference in themselves. Conversations deepened where they once would have stalled. Discomfort was no longer treated as something to escape, but something to sit with. When someone asked an inconvenient question, it was no longer brushed aside automatically. The reflex to protect harmony at any cost had weakened. That shift was subtle, but it mattered. The disappearance, once an unspeakable fracture, had become a reference point. Not a wound to reopen, but a lesson that demanded be remembered. Not constantly, not obsessively, but deliberately. Each year, on Christmas morning, a few people returned to the square at dawn, not because it was required, not because it was announced, but because memory, once given room, often asked to be revisited. They stood quietly, hands in pockets, breath visible in the cold air. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they didn't. There were no candles now, no ritual, just presence. The absence was still there, but it no longer dominated the space. Children who had not been born when the church still stood grew up hearing the story as part of the town's history, not as a warning wrapped in fear, but as a truth wrapped in care. They learned that belief can be powerful without being harmful, that guidance must always leave room for choice, that silence is not neutral when it protects harm. Those lessons traveled with them when they left the town, to schools, to cities, to lives shaped by a deeper awareness of how easily systems can slip into control when no one asks who they serve. The town did not become perfect. It became more awake. There were still disagreements, still mistakes, still moments when people chose convenience over courage. But those moments were no longer invisible. They were named, questioned, sometimes corrected. That was the difference. The disappearance had taught them that erasure does not begin with vanishing. It begins with narrowing, with voices slowly replaced by doctrine, with doubt reframed as danger, with silence mistaken for peace. And it had shown them that places absorb these patterns, holding on to them until someone is willing to listen. The church had done that for decades. Now it no longer needed to. What remained were the echoes, not of sermons or authority, but of choice. The choice to look instead of turn away, to ask instead of assume, to remember instead of bury. In quiet moments, some people admitted they still felt the weight of the past unexpectedly, in the sound of bells from another town, in the way light filtered through winter windows, in the careful placement of shoes by a door. These moments did not frighten them anymore. They reminded them. Memory, they learned, does not exist to punish. It exists to orient. The two who disappeared were never fully recovered. No final account emerged that could satisfy every question. No ending arrived that could be neatly tied off and stored away. But something else happened. They were no longer lost to silence. Their lives, once narrowed to absence, expanded again through understanding, through acknowledgement, through a community willing, at last, to carry them not as shame, but as responsibility. The abandoned church had revealed the truth not by accusing, but by enduring, By waiting. By holding what no one else would hold until the world was ready to see it. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. How many other places are still waiting? How many truths are being preserved in empty buildings, in unspoken traditions, in systems that have outlived their scrutiny? How many disappearances are unfolding quietly, not through force, but through belief left unexamined? The story does not end with this town. It extends outward into every space where certainty is valued over curiosity, where obedience is praised more than agency, where silence is rewarded instead of questioned. The difference now is awareness. The town learned that truth does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it waits, patient and still, inside walls everyone agrees not to enter. It waits for time to loosen fear, for questions to feel safer than answers. And when it finally emerges, it does not demand punishment. It asks for attention. On some mornings, when the snow falls just right and the world feels briefly suspended, people still think about Christmas morning 35 years ago, about untouched gifts, about doors that never opened, about lives that slipped quietly out of view. They do not look away anymore. They hold that memory alongside the present, not as a weight, but as a guide, because disappearance, once understood, carries a responsibility to notice, to intervene, to refuse silence when something begins to narrow instead of open. The abandoned church is gone now, but its lesson remains. And in that way, the truth it held did not disappear at all. It stayed, transformed into vigilance, into empathy, into a quiet promise that what happened once would not be allowed to happen unnoticed again. Not here, not anywhere. Years from now, when the details blur and the sharp edges of the story soften with repetition, what will remain is not the church or the documents, or even the exact sequence of events. What will remain is a feeling, a quiet awareness that settles in when a place has been asked to account for itself. And finally does. The town no longer speaks of the disappearance as something that happened back then. Time has stopped behaving that way around it. Instead, it exists in a strange, continuous tense, woven into daily life in ways that don't announce themselves, in the way people hesitate before dismissing a concern, in the way authority is met with questions instead of automatic agreement, in the way silence is treated as something to be examined, not trusted. These changes are not dramatic. They don't attract attention from the outside, but they are real. On winter mornings, when frost settles on windows and breath turns visible in the air, some residents still wake with the same unease they felt decades ago, though now they understand it differently. It's no longer fear of the unknown. It's recognition of how fragile certainty really is. They understand now that disappearance is rarely about vanishing without a trace. More often, it's about being slowly removed from the center of one's own life. The town carries that understanding carefully, like something earned rather than inherited. There is no pride in it, only responsibility. Visitors who learn the story sometimes ask whether the truth brought closure. The town never answers that question directly. Closure suggests an ending that feels complete, satisfying. This story does not offer that. What it offers instead is clarity, and clarity has a different texture. It is heavier, less comforting, but it allows movement where confusion once held everything still. The empty lot where the church once stood has changed with the seasons. Grass grew in unevenly at first, then thicker. Wild flowers appeared one spring, without anyone planting them. Children began cutting across it again, their games oblivious to the ground's history. Life, persistent and indifferent, reclaimed the space. And yet, those who remember still feel it. Not as dread, not as reverence, but as awareness. A subtle pressure in the chest when they pass by. A reminder that places are not neutral, and neither are the systems we build inside them. The truth did not destroy the town. It refined it. What once relied on unspoken rules now depends on dialogue. What once deferred to tradition now demands context. People no longer assume that longevity equals goodness, or that familiarity guarantees safety. Those lessons ripple outward quietly. Former residents carry them into new communities, into workplaces, families, institutions. They recognize patterns sooner. They notice when guidance becomes coercion, when belonging starts to require disappearance of the self. They speak up more quickly now, That may be the most meaningful legacy of all. The two who disappeared are no longer defined solely by what happened to them. Over time, their lives have been spoken back into fullness, through stories shared without fear, through memories allowed to be complex instead of tidy. They are remembered as people who lived before they vanished, people who laughed, who struggled, who searched for meaning in a world that offered certainty too easily and compassion too narrowly. Their disappearance is no longer treated as a mystery to be solved. It is treated as a responsibility to be honored. Some nights, especially in winter, when the town is quiet and the sky feels impossibly close, people still think about the church, not as it was at the end, but as it must have been at the beginning, full of intention, of belief, of people convinced they were doing something right. That thought no longer feels accusatory. It feels cautionary, because the most unsettling truth uncovered was never about the building or the doctrine or even the disappearance itself. It was about how easily harm can wear the face of care, how control can sound like guidance, how disappearance can be framed as devotion, and how silence, when repeated often enough, can become indistinguishable from consent. The town understands now that evil does not always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it arrives softly, wrapped in language that promises safety, meaning belonging. Sometimes it grows not because people are malicious, but because they are tired, afraid, or desperate to believe that someone else knows the way. That realization has reshaped how people listen. They listen longer, more carefully, for what is being said and for what is being avoided. They understand that questions are not threats, and doubt is not betrayal. That discomfort can be a signal, not a failure. These understandings did not come quickly. They were earned through loss, regret, and the long, painful process of looking honestly at what had been allowed to happen. The abandoned church revealed the truth only because time made denial unsustainable, because decay forced entry, because avoidance eventually collapses under its own weight. Not every place gets that chance. Some truths remain sealed indefinitely, their walls intact, their silence unbroken. Some disappearances never find language. Some communities never learn to look back with enough courage to see what was there all along. That is what makes this story linger, not because it is resolved, but because it is rare. The truth emerged not through heroism or sudden confession, but through patience, through listening to what a place had been holding, through accepting that responsibility does not always come with clear villains or easy absolution. It comes with vigilance. As years pass, fewer people will remember the church standing. Fewer will remember the names without prompting. That is inevitable. But if the lesson holds, if the awareness persists, then the disappearance will not repeat itself in the same way. And that may be the closest thing to justice this story can offer. On Christmas mornings now, the town still wakes quietly. Snow still falls. Light still filters through curtains. Life continues, ordinary and imperfect, but absence is no longer invisible. When something feels wrong, it is named. When silence settles too heavily, it is questioned. When authority speaks too confidently, it is examined. These are small acts, but they are the opposite of disappearance. The abandoned church revealed the truth after 35 years not because it wanted to be discovered, but because truth has a way of insisting on itself when enough time has passed. It waits, and once it is seen, it changes not just what we know, but how we choose to live with what we know. That is what remains now, not the building, not the mystery, not even the disappearance, but a community that learned too late, but not too late to matter, that silence is never empty, and that listening, once it begins, must never stop.